He was dressed in uniform, badge shining under the streetlights. Yet his fellow officers didn't see a colleague, they only saw the color of his skin. What happened next shook the department and ignited a firestorm that reached the courts. The city had just begun to wind down for the night, its skyline glowing against the dark velvet sky. Officer Marcus Green, a respected and seasoned member of the police force, was driving home after a long 12-hour shift. He was still in full uniform, his badge clipped neatly to his chest, and his marked police vehicle rolled steadily through the quiet suburbs. It was a route he had driven hundreds of times, familiar, predictable, but this time something felt off. As he passed under a streetlight, he noticed headlights speeding up behind him. Within seconds, red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror. Marcus frowned. It wasn't unusual to see patrols in this area, but there was no reason for him to be stopped. His vehicle was clearly a department cruiser, and he was visibly in uniform. Still, he slowed and pulled over to the curb as protocol demanded. That the squad car behind him stopped, and two white officers stepped out. Both had their hands near their holsters. Marcus could feel his pulse begin to rise, not out of guilt or fear of the law, but because he knew something wasn't right. He rolled down his window and greeted them calmly, his voice steady. "Evening, officers. Everything all right?" he asked, with a slight nod. But instead of returning the professional courtesy, one officer barked, "Step out of the vehicle." The other approached cautiously, hand resting on his gun. Marcus was stunned. "I'm Officer Green. I'm with the 9th Precinct," he said, gesturing to the department tag on his shirt and the cruiser's emblem. His words seemed to fall on deaf ears. "Out of the car. Now," the officer repeated, louder this time, his tone sharp and suspicious. Marcus didn't argue. He knew better than to resist. Even in a situation as ridiculous as this, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out slowly, hands raised. The two officers closed in, one yelling for him to get on the ground. "This is a mistake," Marcus said, firmly but without raising his voice. "I'm one of you." But it didn't matter. They moved on instinct, or worse, prejudice. One officer roughly pushed him down and snapped the cuffs on his wrists. Marcus winced as his cheek pressed against the cold pavement. A few neighbors had stepped outside, drawn by the flashing lights and shouting. He could hear someone gasp. Another person whispered, "Is that a cop?" The humiliation stung more than the scrape on his jaw. He'd worn the badge with pride. For 10 years, he had served with dignity, risked his life more times than he could count, and yet here he was, face down on the street, treated like a criminal in front of people he had once sworn to protect. After a tense few minutes, the officers finally searched his ID and ran the plates only. Then, realizing their error, one of them muttered something under his breath. The other, without apology or eye contact, unlocked the cuffs and walked away. Marcus stood up slowly, brushing dust from his uniform, fists clenched. They didn't even have the decency to offer an explanation. "We thought the car was stolen," one officer said flatly, then returned to the squad car like nothing had happened. No acknowledgement of the uniform, no recognition of the badge, just a cold, silent retreat. Marcus stood by his cruiser for a moment, trying to catch his breath, trying to understand how quickly things had spiraled. His heart was pounding, but not from fear, from rage. Not just for what had happened to him, but for what it said about the system he worked within. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a warning. In that moment, Marcus realized something profound and painful. No matter how many years of service he had, no matter how many commendations hung in his locker, to some people, even fellow officers, he would always be seen first and only as a black man. The drive home was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He replayed every second of the stop, the orders, the tone, the coldness in their eyes. His wife Kayla saw the tension in his face the moment he walked through the door. When he told her what had happened, her hands shook. They both sat in by silence for a long time. Eventually, Kayla said softly, "You have to do something, Marcus. This can't be the end of it." And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He knew she was right. Something had to change. Not just for him, but for every officer. Every person who had ever been treated like they didn't belong in their own skin. The next morning, Marcus walked into the precinct with a heaviness in his chest that no amount of sleep could ease. The bright fluorescent lights above hummed as usual. Officers moved about in their routines, and radios crackled faintly with dispatch calls. Everything looked the same, but for Marcus, nothing felt normal. He passed by colleagues he had known for years, people he had shared late-night shifts, high-speed chases, and even life-saving moments with, but their eyes either glanced quickly away or carried that awkward look of forced neutrality. No one asked how he was, no one mentioned what happened the night before. The silence wasn't just absence, it was a choice, and it hurt more than the cuffs had. He sat at his desk, opened a blank incident report, and stared at the screen. Part of him still couldn't believe it had happened. Part of him didn't want to make trouble. But the voice in his head, his wife's voice, his conscience was louder. He began typing, recounting every detail from the moment he saw the lights in his rearview mirror to the second they finally uncuffed him without a word. His fingers moved slowly at first, but as the memories flooded back, anger sharpened his words. He submitted the report to Internal Affairs before he could second-guess himself. By lunch, word had spread. It wasn't official, but the station was always full of whispers. Some officers gave him tight nods of support in passing, but none dared say much. Others avoided him altogether, their conversations falling silent when he walked past. The ones who had always joked with him at the coffee machine now stood with their backs turned. Even his captain, a man Marcus had respected for years, gave him nothing but a shallow glance and a mumbled noted when Marcus tried to bring up the incident. The message was clear: keep it quiet, keep it in-house and let it go, but Marcus couldn't let it go. He started having trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's gun pointed at him, felt the pavement against his cheek. He'd wake up in cold sweats, his heart pounding. Kayla urged him to talk to someone, but the department therapist was another uniformman, other link in a chain that already felt too tight. He needed real answers, not corporate sympathy. One evening, he met with an old friend, Deshaun, a former cop who'd left the force years ago after facing similar racial discrimination. They sat on a park bench under a setting sun, watching kids play nearby while Deshaun listened quietly to Marcus's story. When Marcus finished, Deshaun nodded solemnly and said, "You did everything right, but the system isn't built to protect us when we're the victims. It's built to protect itself." The words hit hard. Marcus had always believed in reform from within, but now he wasn't sure where within ended and the war began. Back at work, things got worse. Marcus was suddenly reassigned from field duties to a desk role with no explanation. He was removed from a high-profile task force he had helped build. His requests for meetings with command staff were delayed or denied. The message wasn't subtle anymore, it was punishment. And still, the officers who stopped him continued their shifts like nothing had happened. No suspension, no accountability, just silence and shadows. Marcus knew he couldn't stay quiet. He started documenting everything: emails, voice memos, notes of every strange comment or sudden reassignment. He contacted a civil rights lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Denise Warren, who took one look at the case and said, "They picked the wrong man to mess with." With her help, Marcus began preparing for something far bigger than an internal complaint. They would file a civil lawsuit not just against the two officers, but against the department itself, citing racial profiling, wrongful detainment, and systemic retaliation. Filing the suit was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. The department scrambled. HR called him in for a wellness check. A union rep tried to convince him to withdraw the complaint for the good of the brotherhood, but Marcus wasn't the same man who had pulled over that night. He had seen the line between loyalty and silence, and he had chosen truth. As the news broke, headlines began to swirl. Black officer files suit against own department spread across TV and social media. The world was watching now. Marcus sat with Kayla that night, watching the coverage, feeling the weight of what was coming. He didn't know how it would end, but, for the first time, he didn't feel alone. The silence had been broken, and in its place, a storm was rising. The days that followed were unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in his career. What started as a single report filed in quiet frustration had turned into a public firestorm. The lawsuit became national news overnight. Local reporters camped outside the precinct. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForOfficerGreen and #BlueOnBlack. The image of Marcus in uniform, calm, professional, and betrayed by his own circulated everywhere, igniting outrage and uncomfortable conversations across the country. Inside the department, however, the atmosphere had grown colder, more tense. Co-workers who once called him brother now treated him like a traitor. Some glared openly. Others made snide remarks just loud enough for him to hear. Should have kept it internal. He just made life harder for all of us. Even in the locker room, a place that once felt like a second home, Marcus found his name scratched off his locker in red marker, replaced by a crude nickname he didn't repeat to anyone. The message was clear. In their eyes, he had broken the sacred code of silence. But Marcus wasn't shaken. The pain was real, but so was the purpose. For once, he wasn't just wearing the uniform, he was standing for what it should truly represent. Denise Warren, his lawyer, was relentless. Every day she gathered new evidence, copies of incident reports, department memos, prior complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from records. She dug into the personnel files of the two white officers who had pulled Marcus over and found that both had a pattern of racially motivated stops and citizen complaints that had been quietly buried. As she connected the dots, a troubling pattern emerged, not just an isolated case of misconduct, but a system that protected itself at the cost of justice. "This isn't just about you," she told Marcus during one of their late-night meetings. "This is about hundreds of people who never had to badge to defend themselves." As the case moved toward court, Marcus gave his first interview to a national news anchor. It was filmed in a quiet studio with a single camera, no audience, his voice, his story, and the truth. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "I've worn this badge for over a decade. I've bled with these men, saved lives beside them. But that night, none of it mattered. Not the years, not the service, not even the uniform. All they saw was my skin. The clip went viral. It was raw, heartbreaking, and undeniable. He wasn't just another man with a complaint. He was living proof that the rot wasn't just on the streets but in the heart of the system. The backlash came swiftly. The department issued a cold statement denying wrongdoing, calling the stop a procedural misunderstanding and insisting there was no racial motivation. Marcus was suspended under the guise of departmental review, even as the officers who cuffed him remained on duty. Protesters gathered outside the station, demanding their termination. Meanwhile, some far-right commentators painted Marcus as an opportunist, trying to divide the force, but he held his ground. He didn't answer hate with hate. He didn't lash out. He stayed calm, even as the storm grew louder. What hurt most, though, was the betrayal from those he once trusted. His former partner, Jason, a white officer he'd served with for years, avoided him completely. They had shared close calls, eaten midnight meals together, and had even stood as best men in each other's weddings. Now, Jason wouldn't return a single call or text. It was more than silence, it was abandonment, and it cut deep. But Marcus channeled that pain into purpose. Every insult, every glare, every moment of isolation only fueled his resolve. Meanwhile, the community, especially black residents, rallied around him. At a town hall meeting, an elderly woman stood up and said, "You wore the badge with pride, and they still treated you like nothing. If this can happen to you, what hope do the rest of us have?" Her voice cracked, and others nodded in agreement. For many, Marcus had become more than an officer. He was a mirror, reflecting a truth they had always known, now impossible to deny. As the trial date loomed, Marcus knew the hardest part was still ahead. He would have to relive every moment in front of strangers. He would be picked apart, questioned, and painted as a threat. But he also knew the world was watching, and the truth was finally out of the shadows. He had walked into the fire not for revenge, but for justice. And though the flames burned, he was still standing stronger, clearer, and ready to fight until the last word was spoken. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back wall, their cameras forbidden but their pens ready. Spectators filled every available seat. Activists, curious citizens, off-duty officers, and members of the black community who had followed Marcus Green's story since it broke. The air was thick with anticipation, tension, and the weight of unspoken truths that had long been buried under the polished surface of law enforcement. Marcus sat at the front beside Denise Warren, his attorney, wearing a suit that couldn't hide the quiet storm in his chest. For all his years in uniform, this was the first time he felt like he wasn't just fighting crime, he was fighting history. The prosecution began with cold facts. Denise stood tall, her voice calm but sharp, laying out the sequence of events with surgical precision. She played the body cam footage for the court. There, on the screen, was Marcus in uniform, hands raised, clearly identifying himself as an officer and, yet, still being ordered to the ground like a criminal. The jury watched in silence. Gasps echoed faintly when the video showed the officers cuffing him, ignoring his badge, ignoring his voice. Some jurors looked visibly uncomfortable. Denise turned to them and said, "If that uniform couldn't protect him, what would protect someone without it?" The defense countered with the usual spin. The officers had reasonable suspicion. The area had a recent car theft. They feared for their safety. It was standard procedure. One of their lawyers even implied that Marcus may have been too assertive, subtly painting him as aggressive without saying the word. But every time they tried to justify the stop, the footage pushed back harder. The jury had seen the truth come. Compliance met with irrational fear and force. When Marcus took the stand, the room quieted like a held breath. He adjusted the microphone and began, his voice steady, though emotion crept behind each word. He told them how it felt to be treated like a threat by men who should have been his brothers. How it wasn't the first time he had seen racial bias in the department, but it was the first time it had touched him so directly, so violently. He spoke about the cold pavement beneath his face, the look in the officer's eyes, and the silence that followed from the department he had given 10 years of his life to. At one point, his voice cracked not from weakness, but from the raw weight of remembering that night didn't just break my trust. He said, "It broke my belief that the badge alone was enough to keep me safe." The courtroom remained still, the jury hanging on every word. Denise ended his testimony with a powerful reminder. This is not about one bad night or two bad officers. This is about a system that protects the powerful and punishes the honest. The trial stretched over several days. Witnesses were called, some former officers, some civilians who had seen the stop from their porches. One man testified how shocked he was to see a uniformed officer treated like a suspect. Another, a retired black sergeant, choked back tears as he admitted, "We've all lived in fear of that moment. Marcus, you just happened to be the one who couldn't escape it." The defense tried hard to shift the narrative. They brought up Marcus's past, his disciplinary record, which was clean but scrutinized. They suggested he was bitter about missed promotions, but none of it landed. The more they tried to undermine him, the more they revealed their desperation. The jury wasn't blind. They had seen enough to know the truth didn't lie in technical jargon or half-hearted justifications. Finally, closing arguments were delivered. Denise stood before the jury, not just as an attorney, but as a voice for everyone who had ever been silenced. Marcus Green wore the uniform. He followed every rule, but still, he was thrown to the ground like a suspect, because in the eyes of those officers, no amount of loyalty could outweigh the color of his skin. If that's not profiling, if that's not injustice, then what is? When the jury left, too deliberate, Marcus sat quietly, Kayla gripping his hand tightly. Hours passed, though they felt like years. Then, the courtroom doors opened and the foreperson stood. The verdict was read. In favor of the plaintiff, the officers acted with racial bias and used excessive force. Damages awarded. Gasps, then silence, then tears. Marcus exhaled deeply, not out of victory, but relief. He didn't smile, he didn't cheer, he just sat still, letting the weight of justice finally settle on his shoulders. The court had spoken, the truth had been heard, but Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. The weeks following the verdict passed in a blur of media interviews, community events, and whispered conversations behind closed doors at the department. Marcus Green had become a symbol. Some held him as a hero who stood up against injustice, while others inside the force saw him as the one who tore open wounds they preferred to keep hidden. Yet through all the noise, Marcus stayed grounded. He had never asked to become a face for change. He only wanted to be treated with the same dignity he had given others during his decade of service. But now that the world had turned its eyes toward him, he wasn't going to turn away. He had started this journey to reclaim his voice, and now he would use it. Despite the lawsuit's outcome, Marcus's return to the department was met with visible discomfort. His reinstatement was legally mandated, but the atmosphere felt heavy with resistance. Conversations stopped when he walked into rooms. Some officers glared at him openly. A few refused to work the same shifts. Still, he showed up early, stood tall, and wore his uniform like armor. Because now, more than ever, he knew what that badge meant and what it didn't. It was no longer a symbol of blind loyalty, but a reminder of accountability, truth, and hard-earned respect. And while the brass tried to bury the scandal under press releases and internal memos, Marcus made sure the department's silence couldn't hide what had already been exposed. Reforms were slow, but they began. The court ruling forced the department to implement mandatory racial bias training, independent oversight of use of force incidents, and a complaint review system involving civilian voices. It wasn't enough to dismantle decades of systemic injustice, but it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was change imperfect and overdue, but real. Marcus was asked to participate in several panels and advisory boards. At first, he hesitated. He had spent his whole career enforcing the law, not shaping it. But Denise reminded him, "You didn't break the system, Marcus, you survived it. That gives you the right to demand better." In the community, his presence carried a new weight. Children pointed at him and smiled. Elderly men shook his hand with pride. Young black boys saw in him something powerful, a man who wore the badge but didn't bow to it when it failed him. Parents approached him after town halls to say thank you, their voices trembling with emotion. "You didn't just speak for yourself," one mother told him, holding her son close. "You spoke for all of us." Marcus would nod quietly, humbled by the truth of it. He had gone through hell, but it had meant something. Still, healing was not easy. His relationship with the department was fractured, and parts of it might never be repaired. Some friendships were gone for good, others remained strained but surviving. Surprisingly, one day, Jason, his former partner who had gone silent during the storm, approached him outside the precinct. There was no big apology, no dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet moment between two men who had shared too much to ignore each other forever. "I should have said something," Jason admitted, eyes cast low. "I didn't know what to do. I was afraid." Marcus looked at him for a long moment and simply replied, "So was I, but I still stood up." Jason nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Marcus stood at a community center podium, facing a room full of aspiring young officers, most of them people of color. He looked at their faces, bright with hope but shattered by fear of the world they were about to enter. He took a breath and spoke from his heart. "Being a cop doesn't make you immune to injustice, but if you carry this badge with courage and conscience, if you never let it silence who you are, you can be part of the change we need. The uniform doesn't make you, just your choices do." The room erupted in applause, not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration for a man who didn't just wear the badge. He honored it. As the sun set that evening, Marcus walked through the same neighborhood where it all began. The streets were quiet, the sidewalks empty. He passed the exact spot where he had once been thrown to the ground, his face against the pavement, his identity reduced to fear. But now, he stood tall, head high, heart steady. He wasn't just Officer Marcus Green anymore. He was the man who proved that truth can stand against power, that justice can rise from humiliation, that even in a system built to silence you, one voice, one choice, and one moment of courage can light the path for others. And as he walked on, he smiled, not because the fight was over, but because he had made it through with his honor intact. He hadn't just reclaimed his badge, yet redefined what it meant. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful true stories that deserve to be heard.